The fire in the great hearth of the broken antler had been dying since the second hour past midnight, and nobody had asked me to tend it. That was the kind of invisible I had become. I moved between the long oak tables with a clay pitcher in each hand, filling tankards without being thanked, gathering empty bowls without being seen, stepping aside when men twice my size lurched toward the door without so much as a glance in my direction. My name in this place was Girl, or You There, or nothing at all. I had stopped flinching at nothing a long time ago. The broken antler sat against the outer wall of Greymore, the largest settlement within 3 days' ride of the royal seat of Tharnan. It smelled of wet wool and tallow smoke, and something older, beneath both something I had never been able to name in all my years of breathing it. The beams above were black with age. The rushes on the floor were never fresh enough, and the men who filled those benches every night were not the kind who left a coin behind out of kindness. I was 23 years old. I had worked this floor since I was tall enough to carry a full pitcher without spilling. Before that, I swept the yard. Before that, I peeled roots in the kitchen beside old Odessa, who was the closest thing to family I had left in the world. Odessa was still in that kitchen tonight, her knuckles red from the cold that crept through the stones, her lips moving in the quiet prayers she said to gods that most folks in Greymore had long since stopped believing in. She was the only one here who knew my full name. Wren, she would say, in that low and careful voice she saved for the things that mattered. Keep your head down. Keep your feet moving. That is how a woman like you survives a place like this. And I had listened. I always listened. Which was why when the outer door swung open at the 3rd hour and every man in that room went still, I noticed it before a single word was spoken. It was not the cold that came in with them. It was the pressure. The kind that lives in the air just before lightning splits the sky, when the fine hairs along your arms rise for no reason you can name, and your body understands something your mind has not yet caught up to. My step slowed. The pitcher in my right hand felt suddenly heavier. 4 of them came through the door first. Tall men in dark traveling cloaks, their boots caked with the mud of a hard road, their hands resting near the hilts of their swords with the easy familiarity of men who had drawn steel many times and never once hesitated. Their eyes swept the room in a single clean arc, not curious, not searching, measuring the way wolves measure an open field before they decide to cross it. And then he came through the door. I do not know how to tell you what happened in my chest when I first saw him. It was not admiration. Not exactly. It was closer to the feeling of standing at the edge of a cliff you did not know was there. That sudden lurch of understanding, of scale, of how very small you are against something vast and old and utterly indifferent to your smallness. I was taller than the soldiers who flanked him. His hair was black, worn in heavy braids that fell past his shoulders and caught the low firelight like dark water moving over stone. His eyes, even across the length of that smoky and crowded room, were the color of a winter sky in the last moment before the light leaves it. A pale, piercing blue that did not blink when it settled on a thing. A thin scar traced the edge of his jaw. Old, silver pale, the kind that had been earned, not given. He wore a vest of dark leather crossed with belts, bracers at his wrists, a fur mantle at his shoulders so black it seemed to swallow the edges of the candlelight around him. No crown, but there was no need for one. Every line of him announced what he was: Kaelin, King of Tharn, Alpha above all alphas in the Northern Realm. I had heard his name spoken in this very tavern, the way people speak of storms and old wars, with a mixture of fear and inevitability, as though he were a thing that happened to you, rather than a man who walked among you. He had ended the border skirmishes without ever sitting down to negotiate. He had stripped 3 noble houses of their rank in a single afternoon's council. And in 10 years upon the throne, he had never once taken a queen. The rumors about why ranged from cruelty to grief, to something colder and stranger that no one in Greymore dared say out loud. And now he was here, in the Broken Antler. And I was standing 3 feet from the table his men were moving toward with a half-empty pitcher of watered ale in my hand, and a dress mended at the hem. So many times the thread had become more of the garment than the cloth ever was. So I made the only sensible choice a woman in my position could make. I turned to disappear into the kitchen. You. The word was not loud. It did not need to be. It carried the way thunder carries. Not by volume, but by the way. It changes everything in the air around it. I stopped. Every other soul in that tavern stopped with me, though they were more careful about not showing it. Heads bent low, eyes dropped to the grain of the tables. Conversations did not so much end as simply dissolve the way frost dissolves when the sun finally clears the ridge. I turned back, slowly. I was looking at me. Not through me, not past me, not in the way that men in taverns look at serving girls, as backdrop, as furniture that happens to move. He was looking at me with those winter eyes, and there was something in the look I could not read. Something sharp, almost puzzled, as though I had done a thing he had not expected, and he was still deciding what it meant. I held the pitcher in both hands, and I waited. One of his men leaned close and murmured something at his ear. Kalen did not acknowledge it. He did not look away from me. "Bring wine," he said. "The table by the south wall." That was all. He crossed to the table. His men followed, and the room let out its breath, careful and slow, the way a man breathes out when he is checking to see whether a wound is deep enough to kill him. I went to the kitchen. Odessa looked up from the fire the moment I pushed through the door, and whatever she saw on my face made her set the ladle down against the pot. "What happened?" she said. "The Alpha King is here." My voice came out steady. I was proud of that. "He wants wine." The south wall table. She was quiet for 3 whole seconds, which was long for Odessa. Then she moved to the high shelf where the good wine was kept, the dark bottles that Halvar only ever opened for guests with silver, and she pressed one into my hands. Her grip closed hard around my fingers before she let go. "Head down," she said. "Feet moving." I nodded. I went back through the door. What I did not tell Odessa, what I would barely allow myself to think, even in the private dark of my own skull, was that when Kalen's gaze had found me across that room, something inside my chest had done a thing it had never done before. Not fear, not quite. Something that felt God help me, like recognition. I carried the wine to the south wall. I set it down without spilling a drop. I kept my eyes on the table, on the grain of the wood, on the simple task of the thing. And then his second, a broad and dark-bearded man I would later come to know as Roderick, looked at me with a smile that held no warmth at all, and said loud enough for the whole table to hear it, "Little serving girl, you are braver than I expected. Walking up to this table without your hands shaking once. It was a test, the kind wolves give, to see what flinches." And I finally looked up. I met the Alpha King's eyes, directly. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the fire crackling in the hearth across the entire length of the room. Kaelin's expression did not change, but something moved behind those pale eyes. Something fast, something unreadable, something alive. And for one suspended moment, I had the strange and certain sense that I had just passed a test I did not know I was taking. "Leave her," Kaelin said, still looking at me. Roderick went quiet at once. I set the last cup on the table, with steady hands turned, and walked away. Behind me, I heard nothing. No laughter, no dismissal, only silence. And beneath it so low, I nearly misted the sound of the Alpha King exhaling. Slow, deliberate, like a man recalibrating something he had been certain of only a moment before. I did not look back, but I felt the weight of that gaze follow me across the room long after I had vanished into the crowd. I did not sleep that night. When the last candle was snuffed, and the final drunk had stumbled out into the black cold of the Greymoor streets, I sat on the narrow bench beside the dying kitchen fire and tried to make sense of the thing that had settled in my chest like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples would not stop. Odessa had gone to bed an hour before. Halvard, the innkeeper, a heavy man with a permanent squint and coin-stained fingers, had retreated the moment the king's soldiers secured the upper floor for their lord's rest. He had not spoken a word to me all evening, which was not unusual. What was unusual was the way he had watched me, from the corner of his eye. Every single time I crossed toward the south wall table, I noticed things like that. I always had. Because when you spend enough years being invisible, you develop a different kind of sight. You stop looking at what people show you, and you start watching what they try so hard to hide. What Halvard was hiding, I suspected, was fear. Kings do not stop at taverns like the Broken Antler without a reason. Men like Kaelin of Tharn do not move without intention. And the fact that he had ridden into Greymoor with no riders sent ahead, no demand for proper quarters. At the Lord's Hall in the Upper District meant that whatever had brought him here, he had not wanted it known that he was coming. I pulled my knees up to my chest, and I stared into the embers. "Leave her." 2 words, spoken without heat, without explanation. The kind of command that does not justify itself because it does not need to. And it was not the command that unsettled me. It was the pause before it, that single suspended breath in which the Alpha King had looked at me, not as an inconvenience to be managed, but as a thing that required his actual attention. No one had looked at me that way in a very long time. Perhaps no one ever had. I let the thought dissolve before it could become something dangerous. And I rose, and I went to check that the kitchen door was bolted for the night. Morning came gray and damp, the kind of autumn dawn that smells of wet stone and cold ash, and the first true breath of a winter, still weeks away. I rose before Odessa, built the fire, set the morning broth to simmer before the guard post outside had even changed its watch, and I had almost convinced myself that the night before had been an ordinary thing, that I had simply served wine to powerful men and lived through it the way I had lived through so much else. Then the door between the kitchen and the hall swung open, and Roderick filled the frame. He was even larger in the morning light. Dark-bearded, broad through the jaw, pale green eyes that held a quality I recognized from certain animals, the absolute certainty that they could afford to be patient because the ending was already decided. "The king wants breakfast," he said, "and he wants you to bring it." Odessa had appeared silent at the hearth behind me. She said nothing. but I felt her stillness the way you feel a held breath in a dark room. "I will bring it when it is ready," I said. Roderick's eyes narrowed a fraction. He does not usually wait. "Then he will have the rare experience of it this morning, Said." And I turned back to the fire. There was a pause long enough that I thought he might argue. Then I heard his boots retreat, and the door swing shut behind him. Odessa touched my shoulder. Once. Brief. Her hand was shaking. Mine was not. I thought about while I cut the bread. I brought the tray to the south wall table 20 minutes later. Dark bread, soft cheese, a bowl of the morning broth, a small portion of salted pork, and a cup of the herbed tisane that Odessa brewed for cold mornings, the kind that cleared a man's head and settled his stomach after a long ride. Kaelin was alone, in the full light of morning, without the drama of the night before. He was somehow both more and less than I had built him into in my sleepless head. The fur mantle was gone. His braids were loose and slightly undone at the ends from sleep, and he sat with a rolled parchment spread flat before him, one hand holding down the curling edge, his eyes moving slowly over whatever was written there. He did not look up when I approached. I set the tray down. I arranged the cup. I straightened the bread that did not need straightening. "You are not afraid of me." It was not a question. His voice in the morning was lower, rougher at the edges, stripped of the ceremony of the night before. I considered the thing honestly, the way I always considered things before I let a word leave my mouth. "I am somewhat afraid of you," I said. "But I am more afraid of burning the bread." The silence that followed was 3 seconds long, and then something happened at the corner of his mouth. Barely a movement, hardly worth the naming of it. But it was there. "Sit," he said. Not louder, just final. I sat across from him. He rolled the parchment closed and set it aside. And he looked at me with those pale eyes in the gray light, the look of a man who had come upon a thing he had not prepared a category for. "Last night," he said, "when Roderick spoke to you, your scent did not change." I held his gaze. "My scent." "Fear has a scent," he said. "So does anger. So does the moment a person decides to yield." When men test a serving girl the way Roderick tested you, there is always a shift, always something that moves in the air. He paused. Yours did not. I turned the thought over carefully before I answered. "Perhaps I have simply had a great deal of practice," I said. At not shifting, something moved in his eyes. Not softness. More like a man doing sums a second time and getting a different answer. "What is your name?" he asked. "Wren." "How long have you served in this place, Wren?" "Long enough to know which tables leave a coin and which ones don't," I said. "And long enough to know that when a king rides into a village tavern with no riders sent ahead and takes a table against the back wall, it is not because he was hungry for a change of scenery." That almost movement again, at the corner of his mouth. "You are observant." "I am invisible," I said. And I heard how flat and how true it came out. Invisible people see everything. He was quiet for a moment that stretched longer than the ones before it. Outside, the wind pressed against the shuttered windows with a low and mournful sound. Somewhere above us, one of his men crossed the floor, and the boards groaned under the weight of him. "I came to Greymore," Kaelin said at last, "because there are reports of trouble on the northern trade road. Merchants gone missing. Convoys delayed with no explanation. My council believes it is bandits." His eyes held mine. "I do not believe it is bandits." I did not ask him why he was telling this to a serving girl. I suspected he was not entirely sure of the answer himself. "There is a man," I said. Slowly. "He comes through Greymoor every fortnight. He carries a trader's seal, but he never carries any goods. He sits at the far corner table near the door, and he meets with a different man each time. They do not eat. They do not drink. They speak quietly for half an hour. They exchange a thing small enough to close a fist around. And then they leave. Separately." Kalen had gone very still. "How many times have you seen this?" he asked. 7, I said. The last was 4 nights past. He looked at me for a long moment. Outside, the wind pushed harder at the shutters, and the fire popped once sharp as a snapped bone. "And you told no one," he said. "I am a serving girl," I said, quietly. No one would have listened. The words landed in the room like something heavy and true. He did not argue them, which told me he understood exactly and without flattering himself how the world worked for a woman in my position. But he was looking at me now in a way that was different from anything the broken antler had ever aimed at me. Not pity, not dismissal, not the casual blindness of men who look through a serving girl the way they look through glass. I was looking at me as though I were useful, as though I were in some way he had not walked in expecting necessary. "Roderick," he called, without raising his voice. The man appeared in the doorway within seconds. His eyes went at once to me seated across from his king, and something flickered through his face. Surprise. Quickly caught and put away. "Bring my map of the northern road," Kalen said, "and close the outer door." Roderick vanished. The outer door shut with a heavy and final sound, and in the quiet that came after, with the gray light at the windows, and the fire warm against my back, the Alpha, King of Tharn, spread his hands flat upon the table and looked across it at a serving girl who had been invisible for the better part of her life. "Tell me everything you remember," he said. And for the first time in longer than I could clearly recall, someone was waiting, truly waiting, to hear what I had to say. I talked for a long time. He asked precise questions, and precise questions deserve precise answers. And I found I had stored far more than I ever knew in the quiet chambers of my own watching. The man with the trader's seal. Medium height. Broad through the shoulders. A scar that ran from his left ear to the corner of his jaw. Too clean to be a fighting scar. The kind of mark left by something done on purpose. He wore the colors of no house I could name. His horse glimpsed once through the small side window carried no brand on its flank. The men he met changed each time, but 3 of them repeated. One a tanner from the lower district, a man named Pell, who had started coming to the Antler some 8 months back, and who always paid with coin a little too new and a little too clean for a tanner's hands. One a traveler whose name I never learned, but whose cloak bore a small stitched emblem at the collar, a design I described to Kalen with great care. And here he went very still. The 3rd was a woman, which was the thing that had made me notice her at all. Women do not often conduct quiet business in the back corners of taverns at strange hours. She was older, silver at the temples, and she moved with the straight-backed posture of a person who had once been trained to stand in the formal courts of great houses. Roderick had spread the map across the table by now, and Kalen was marking points along it with the blunt end of a stylus while I spoke. He did not interrupt. He did not doubt me aloud. He simply listened and marked, and now and then asked me to repeat a small detail with a focus so complete that it made me dizzy the plain and unfamiliar vertigo of being taken seriously. When I finished, Kalen sat back and studied the map a long while. Roderick broke the silence first. She could be wrong, he said, not unkindly, just the caution of a man whose whole purpose was to poke holes in a thing before it hardened into a decision. Or she could be spinning a tale. A serving girl with information that happens to be exactly what the king came here hoping to find. The moment she described the collar emblem, Kaelin said, quietly cutting across him, she stopped spinning anything. Roderick went still. The one she described, Kaelin went on, his eyes never leaving the map, is the private seal of House Virant. He paused. Which has been dissolved these past 6 years. Which means the only people still using that seal are the ones who believe the house will rise again. The silence in the tavern had changed its shape entirely. House Virant, I said, slowly. The house that was stripped of its lands. Kaelin looked at me, sharply. You know your kingdom's history. Odessa taught me to read, I said. And Halvard keeps a chest of old records in the back room that no one ever opens. I have had a great deal of time, and very little else to spend it on. Something crossed Roderick's face then. Not the suspicion from before. Something more complicated. He was turning me over in his mind, like a piece he had been holding upside down the whole while. Kaelin rose from the table. He was very tall, standing. I had marked it the night before, but in the close space of the morning kitchen, it registered differently as a fact about the room rather than the man. He crossed to the window and looked out at the gray moor morning, his hands clasped behind his back. How many people in this village know your face, he asked, without turning. Most of them, I said. I have served here for years, and how many of them truly see you, he said when they look. The question was quiet, and strangely careful. Almost none, I answered. Honestly. He turned from the window, and his pale eyes found mine with the same directness that had stopped me cold the night before. Then you are worth more to me here than any soldier I could post at that door. And I felt the shape of what he was about to ask, before he shaped it into words. A great many things moved through me at once. Something that might have been fear, and something else. Something treacherous. Something that felt far too much like wanting to say yes. You want me to watch, I said. Continue exactly as you are, he said. Report what you see. The man with the seal will come again, you said, every fortnight. That gives us 10 days. He paused. I cannot station my soldiers in this village without alerting whoever watches this road. But a serving girl who has always been here. A woman no one has ever bothered to see. She is still invisible, I finished. He nodded once. Slow, certain. If the ones I watch realize that I am watching them, I asked what then. Then you send word to the garrison on the East Road, and you do not wait to see what happens next, Roderick said. And his voice was different now, stripped of its earlier edge. Something closer to plain concern. There will be a man stationed there who will know your face. A blacksmith's apprentice. Torvald, young, red hair, easy to find. I looked at Kaelin. And you, I said, where will you be? Tharnan, he said, visible. So that no one along this road suspects for a moment that their plans have been noticed. Something moved briefly through his face. I do not enjoy leaving a problem unattended. Then why do it? I said. It was a bolder question than I had meant to ask. I felt Roderick's attention sharpen at once. But Kaelin did not look away, and he did not look offended. He looked, if anything, as though the question had caught hold of something honest in him. Because the alternative, he said slowly, is to ride in openly, and watch every man I need to find vanish into the forest roads before I can learn where those roads lead. A pause. Sometimes the most powerful thing a king can do is appear to do nothing at all. I thought about that. That must be very difficult for you, I said. Roderick made a sound that on a different morning might almost have been a laugh he was trying to swallow. Kaelin looked at me with an expression I could not fully read, but there was no anger in it. There was something closer to relief, as if he were not accustomed to being spoken to so plainly and had not realized until this very moment how much he had been starving for it. "It is," he said, simply. He left an hour later. His men assembled and cloaked for the road, their horses steady in the muddy yard behind the tavern. Odessa watched from the kitchen door, with her arms folded and her mouth pressed into the thin line she wore when she was frightened and had decided not to say so. Before he mounted, Kaelin paused in the yard and looked back at the door where I stood with my apron tied at my waist and my braid coming loose from the morning's work. He said nothing sentimental. He was not I was already learning a man who used his words as decoration. What he said was this: 10 days, Ren. Pay attention. And then he was on his horse. And then he was at the gate. And then the sound of hooves on the Greymoor Road faded into the gray morning and was gone. Odessa came to stand at my shoulder. "Well," she said, softly. "Well, I agreed. You are going to do it." I watched the empty road where the dust the horses had kicked up was already settling back into the mud. "Someone has to," I said. She was quiet a moment. "Then that is not the reason," she said. I did not answer her, but I did not deny it either, which was its own kind of answer, and Odessa had known me far too long to miss it. I went back inside, and I began to clear the breakfast table. The rolled parchment Kaelin had been studying was gone, but beneath where it had lain, pressed flat by its weight into the old wood, was a single coin, not a common copper, a silver piece, stamped with the sigil of the Royal House of Tharn, not payment. The morning meal had not cost half so much. Something else, then. Something I held in my open palm for a long moment before I closed my fingers around it. Outside, the wind shifted, and for the first time that season, I smelled the true cold of the coming winter on the air. 10 days. I tucked the coin into the pocket sewn inside my apron against my hip, where I could feel the shape of it as I moved. And I went back to work. But the work was different now. Because I was different now. Not because a king had walked through a door and seen me. Not only that, but because for the first time in 23 years of keeping my head down and my feet moving, someone had asked me to lift my eyes and look and trust that what I saw might matter. What I did not know that gray morning, what I could not have known, standing there with a dead man's silver warming against my hip, was that the trouble on the northern road did not begin with House Virant. It began with me. It began 15 years before in a kitchen not so different from this one, with a woman whose face I could still almost remember, and a whisper I had spent my whole life trying to forget. But that is a thing I did not yet understand. On that morning, I understood only this: the fire needed tending, and no one had asked me to do it. So I did it anyway, because I had finally, after all these years, begun to suspect that the doing of a quiet and unasked thing was not the same as being small, and 10 days was not very long at all. The traitor came back on the 9th day. I had almost begun to doubt myself, because 8 days is a long time to hold a thing this sharp inside a body this small. 8 days of moving through the ordinary rhythms of the broken antler, while a second self stood behind my eyes watching. Always watching, until the watching wore a groove in me so deep I could feel it when I closed my eyes at night. Every unfamiliar face at the door adjusted my pulse. Every quiet word, spoken in a corner, pulled my ear toward it, without my leave. And Odessa watched me the way she always watched me when she was afraid. Which is to say, she said nothing at all. On the morning of the 9th day, I woke before the birds and lay in the narrow dark of the room I shared with the kitchen stores, staring up at the beams, thinking about a thing I had no business thinking about. Kalen. The way he had bent over that map with a focus so complete, it made the air feel thin. The way he had said, "Sometimes the most powerful thing a king can do is appear to do nothing." A sentence that had lodged in me like a splinter, because it named with a terrible precision the exact strategy I had used to survive my whole life without ever once giving it a name. I pressed the heel of my hand hard against my breastbone and told myself firmly to stop. So I stopped. Except I did not. Not really. Because a woman can command her own foolishness all she likes, and her heart will simply wait for her to fall asleep and start up again. That evening, as the torches along the walls were being lit against the early dark, the door opened, and the man with the traitor's seal walked in. He looked exactly as I had described him to a king 9 days before. Medium height, broad through the shoulders, the clean scar from ear to jaw. He wore undyed wool, and his eyes moved over the room with the practiced carelessness of a man who had trained himself to look without appearing to look. I recognized the trick, because I used it myself. He sat at the far corner table, the door table, his table. I picked up a pitcher, and I crossed to him. "Wine or ale?" I asked, not looking at him, keeping my voice in the flat and bored register of a woman who has asked the same 6 words 10,000 times and expects nothing of interest from the answer. "Ale," he said. I poured. I left. And for the next 2 hours I worked that room, and I watched without watching, and I gathered everything. Pell the tanner came in half an hour later and sat 3 tables off, drinking with men who looked like friends. Except twice his eyes drifted to the corner, and twice the traitor's hand moved flat against the tabletop, in a gesture too small and too deliberate to be an accident. A signal, a confirmation. The woman came last. The silver-templed woman with the court posture. She did not sit with the traitor. She took the table nearest the hearth beside mine and ordered hot wine, and made a fine performance of a weary traveler warming her old bones by the fire. Except her chair was angled just so, in a way that gave her a clean line of sight to the corner. And when the traitor rose to step out into the yard, she rose 2 minutes behind him, and she was back before he was. They had done this before. The whole thing was too clean, too rehearsed. A dance performed by people who had performed it many times. And there was something else. Because when she passed my table, on her way back from the yard, close enough that her skirts brushed the bench, she looked at me. Not the way a traveler looks at a serving girl. She looked at me the way you look at a face you are trying to place. A small frown, a tilt of the head, there and then gone, smoothed away in half a breath, and a cold thing moved down the length of my spine. Because I had spent 9 days learning to see these people. And for one terrible moment, I understood that one of them might have been learning to see me too. I told myself I imagined it, which is what a person always tells herself right before the thing she imagined turns out to be real. When the traitor finally left alone through the main door, with the unhurried step of a man with nowhere in the world he needed to be, I untied my apron with hands that had gone very steady, the way they always did in the moment that mattered, and I told Halvard I needed air. He did not look up from his coin. "Do not be long," he said. I went out through the kitchen yard, around the side, to the east road. Torvald was exactly where Roderick had promised. Red-haired, young, doing a passable impression of a man sharpening a blade with nothing at all on his mind. I passed close enough to speak without slowing. "Tonight," I said. "All three. The corner table. And the woman with silver at her temples." He did not turn his head, but his hand stilled on the whetstone for just a moment. I went back to the tavern, and I finished my shift. And I waited for the thing that happens next in the stories the traveling bards tell. The soldiers appearing out of the dark. The arrests made clean and swift. The danger folding itself up neatly into a resolution before the last log burns down in the hearth. Except that is not what happened. What happened was 3 more days of silence. 3 more days of carrying pitchers and clearing bowls and watching the door and sleeping badly. 3 more days of pressing my palm to my chest in the dark to remind myself that the strange, suspended feeling living there was not a fever, that it was something else, something I still did not have a safe name for. And on the 4th morning, after I spoke to Torvald in the road, it was not soldiers who came. It was Odessa. She came into the storeroom before dawn, before the birds, before I had even risen, and she sat down on the edge of my narrow cot in the dark, and I knew from the weight of her sitting that something had broken. "Ren," she said. Just my name. And then nothing for a long while. I sat up. The cold air found my shoulders. I could not see her face in the dark, only the shape of her, bent, her hands folded hard in her lap. "They came to the kitchen last night," she said. "After you slept. 2 of the king's men. And a 3rd man, I did not know, a clever one with a quiet voice." My whole body had gone still. Alaric, I thought. The one Kalen had called his eyes and ears. The one who managed what he had called so carefully, the kingdom's intelligence. "They asked me questions," Odessa said. "About the old records, about House Virant, about who in this village could read and write, and who had reason to know the history of a house that fell before half these fools were born." She stopped. And then she said the thing I did not expect. "They found a letter. Ren. In the safe house beyond the west wall. A letter about the movements on the road. And the hand that wrote it." "The hand that wrote it." Her voice broke clean in half. "The hand looks like mine." The room tilted, because it made no sense. Because Odessa could barely hold a quill without her old fingers cramping Odessa, who muttered prayers to dead gods over a soup pot. Odessa, who had never in her life done a thing more treasonous than water down the ale, when Halvard was not looking, except the hand looks like mine. And a cold and dreadful arithmetic began to work itself out somewhere beneath my ribs, because I had learned to read from Odessa. She had taught me. My letters were her letters. My hand was shaped from hers, the way a river is shaped from the ground it runs through. "Odessa," I said. My voice came out very small. "What are you not telling me?" And in the dark of that storeroom with the winter dawn, still an hour off, the only mother I had ever known, began at last to tell me the truth. "Your mother," she said, "did not die of a fever." The words fell into the dark and stayed there. I did not move. I do not think I breathed. "She served in a great house," Odessa said. 15 years ago, in the north. A house called Virant. She was a kitchen girl like you, invisible like you. And one night she carried a tray into a room where she should not have been, and she heard men speak of a thing that men do not let a servant live to repeat. The fire in my chest had gone to ice. Shiran Odessa said, "In the dark, in the snow, with a child of 8 years old wrapped in her cloak, and she got as far as Greymore, as far as the back door of this tavern, and she gave me the child. Her hand found mine in the dark, and gripped it, and she gave me a name. Wren. I could not speak. 3 days later they found her," Odessa said, "in the woods past the mill. They called it a fever because a fever asks no questions, and a dead serving woman with no house and no name gets no better burying than that. And I took the child, and I hid her in plain sight, where no one would ever think to look for the daughter of a woman who knew too much. In a kitchen, behind a soup pot, with her head down, and her feet moving, I whispered. And her feet moving." Odessa said, "Yes. The whole of my life reordered itself in a single, silent, breaking moment. Because I had thought I was invisible by nature. I had thought it was simply the shape of me. The small and gray and unremarkable shape of a girl no one bothered to see. And it had never once been that. It had been her. 15 years of Odessa keeping me small on purpose, keeping me low, keeping me nothing, not out of cruelty, but because being nothing was the only thing that had ever kept me alive. Why did you never tell me?" I said. And I heard the ache in it, the child in it, the part of me that was still 8 years old and running through snow. "Because a secret a child does not carry," she said, "is a secret a child cannot spill. And because every year I meant to tell you, and every year I looked at you alive, breathing safe, and I could not bear to hand you the thing that would put you back in the snow." "The letter," I said, my mind lurching back toward the cold present, "in the hand that looks like yours. It looks like yours because it looks like mine, because you taught me, because someone," there it was, "because someone had used my hand against me. Someone who had seen the way I formed my letters. Someone who had been close enough at some point to study the shape of the only thing Odessa had ever given me that the world could not take away. Which meant they knew. The woman with the silver temples who had looked at me across a crowded tavern as though she were trying to place a face 15 years gone. She knew who I was. I was on my feet before I decided to stand. Odessa caught my wrist. "Where are you going?" she said. "To send word," I said. "To the garrison. Now. Before, because Kalin had told me. Send word, and do not wait to see what happens next." And I had watched. And I had waited. And I had let 3 days of silence lull me into believing that silence was the same as safety, when silence is only ever the sound of something being decided somewhere you cannot see. I did not reach the door, because the door reached me first. It opened, and the storeroom filled with gray light and the shape of a man, and my whole body seized with the certainty that I had waited too long, until I saw the red hair. Torvald. He was bleeding. A long shallow line across his brow. Blood in his eyebrow. Blood down the side of his young face, and his chest heaving like a man who had run the whole way from the East Road. "They took the corner table," he said, between breaths. "2 nights ago, on the North Road. Pell as well." He put a hand against the doorframe to hold himself up. "But the woman," he looked at me. "The woman came for you." The next hour is a thing I remember in pieces. I remember Odessa moving faster than an old woman has any right to move, pressing a cloth to Torvald's brow, pushing bread and a heavy cloak into my hands both at once. I remember Halvard appearing in the kitchen doorway in his nightshirt, his squinting face gone slack and gray, understanding all at once that whatever was happening under his roof was far too large for him to have ever wanted any part of it. I remember Torvald's voice low and urgent, telling me what he knew. That soldiers had taken the traitor and the tanner clean on the North Road exactly as I had reported them. That the woman had been faster. That she had not run for the border the way a hunted conspirator runs. That she had come instead to Greymore, in the dark, with men, asking a very particular question in a very quiet voice. Where is the serving girl? Not any serving girl. The one from Viren. And I understood then, with a clarity that arrived like cold water, that I had made a terrible and simple error. I had thought I was the watcher, the invisible eye at the edge of the room. I had thought the whole long dance turned on what I could see, when the truth was that someone in that dance had been watching me the whole while, and had been waiting patiently, the way wolves wait for the moment I made myself visible enough to find. We rode before the sun cleared the ridge. Torvald could not sit a horse, not with his head still bleeding, so it was two of the garrison men who came for us grim and fast and saying very little, and it was Odessa I fought with in the yard in the last cold minutes before we left. Because she would not come. You will slow them, she said, and I will not be the reason they catch you. Odessa, I hid you for 15 years in a soup pot, she said, and her old chin was shaking, and her voice was not. Do you think I cannot hide myself for a fortnight? Go. To Ashkeld, to the king. He is the only wall high enough now. Go. And she took my face in both her rough, warm hands, the way she had done since I was small, since I was 8 and running. Head down, she said. And then something crossed her face. Something that was almost in that terrible morning a smile. No, she said. Not this time. She let me go. Head up, she said, feet moving. I rode north. Ashkeld rose out of the pale morning of the second day, like a thing dreamed rather than built. Gray stone, black iron, towers that did not so much stand against the sky as own it. But it was not cold, the way I had built it, cold in my mind, through years of listening to men speak Kaelin's name like a storm coming. It was alive. Torchlight in every hall, the smell of pine resin burning, the clang of the training yard, the deep bell in the tower marking the hours, servants calling across the courtyards. A whole living body of a place with a pulse I could feel through the soles of my worn boots. Roderick met me at the eastern gate. He looked at me for a long moment, taking in the mud of the road and the cloak that was not mine, and the thing in my face that had not been there in the tavern. She told you, he said, quietly. He knew. Somehow he knew. Because of course, Kaelin's people had learned in 3 days what it had taken me, 15 years and a broken dawn, to be told. Everything I said. Then you know why the king has not slept, Roderick said. They brought me to the great hall. Not the throne room, Roderick told me under his breath, which was for judgments and declarations, and the machinery of a crown. The great hall was where Kaelin worked, where the maps were spread, and the real decisions bled out slow across long tables into the small hours. He was standing at the center table when I came in, and he looked up at once, and I watched something move across his face that he did not manage to put away in time. You are not hurt, he said. No. Good. He said it quietly. And then he looked back down at the map, and the set of his shoulders told me that he had been far more afraid of the answer than he would ever let a room see. There were others in the hall. A silver-haired woman near 40 sharp of eye, whom he named Vesna his chief counsel. A lean and precise man, Alaric, who kept the kingdom's eyes and ears, and a gray-bearded warrior called Garrick, who commanded the northern garrison, and who looked at me as I entered like a man, revising a sum in real time. They had my report already. My 9 days had traveled ahead of me and changed things in this room before I ever set foot in it. And I answered Alaric's questions with the same flat precision I had used at a tavern table 9 days and a lifetime ago. The seal, the tanner's too clean coin, the stitched collar, and the woman with silver at her temples. Alaric wrote it all down with a fine quill, but it was Vesna who went still. Vesna who set down her cup. Vesna who looked not at me, but at Kaelin, and said one word, Sabine, and the temperature in the great hall of Ashkeld dropped 10 degrees. Kaelin did not move, but his hand flat on the map pressed slowly into the wood until the knuckles whitened. "Who is Sabine?" I said, because no one had answered, because the whole room had gone to that specific silence that falls when everyone knows a thing and no one wants to be the one to say it out loud. It was Kaelin who finally spoke. She came out of House Virant, he said, long before it fell. She was raised in it, trained in it, one of theirs to the bone. He was not looking at me. He was looking at nothing, at a thing gone many years. When Virant began to rot from the inside, she read the wind, and she left it behind, and she came to my court, a young woman with a sharp mind, and no house to answer to. I made her my counsel, my closest. His jaw worked. She sat where Vesna sits now. She knew every plan before it left my mouth. And when House Virant moved against the crown in the year I took the throne 10 years ago, it was Sabine who opened the door for them from the inside. Her old house. Her true one. I had simply been too proud to see it. We stopped them. Barely. And when the dust settled, 3 noble houses lost their rank. Virant was marked for dissolution, and Sabine was gone. Into the border roads, before I could learn where those roads led. A pause. I have not taken a counsel that close since. I have not taken anything that close since. And I understood in one falling moment why an Alpha King had ruled 10 years without a queen. It was not cruelty. It was not grief exactly. It was a man who had once handed his whole trust to a person and watched that person use it as a blade, and had decided quietly and completely never to hand it to anyone again. And I understood something colder. She came up in House Virant, I said. Slowly, the words assembling themselves as I spoke them. Which means 15 years ago, before ever she came to your court, she was already one of them. She was in that house, in those rooms. Kaelin's eyes came to me. The kitchen girl, who heard too much, I said, and my voice did a thing, I hated it, shook, did not die, because of some faceless plot. 15 years ago, in House Virant, a serving woman carried a tray into the wrong room and heard the people of that house speak treason above her head. And one of the people in that room had her hunted down and killed for it. And that girl had a daughter, 8 years old, who ran, and who that same person has spent 15 years believing was a loose thread she failed to cut. The great hall was utterly silent. Kaelin had gone very, very still, and she found that thread, I said, in a tavern in Greymoor, serving wine to a king. I looked up, and I met the pale eyes of Kaelin of Tharn across the length of that map-strewn table, and I said the truest and most terrifying sentence I had ever spoken aloud. Your enemy and my mother's murderer are the same woman, and she has known who I was far longer than I have. The fire cracked in the great hearth. No one moved, and in the ringing quiet that followed, I understood at last that the two halves of my life, the invisible serving girl and the daughter who ran through snow, had never been two things at all. They were one thread, and Sabine had come back to Greymore to finish cutting it. But there was more. There was the thing that had been sitting wrong in me since the storeroom, the small cold splinter I had not yet had time to name. Because Torvald had said soldiers took the traitor on the North Road exactly as I reported them. Exactly. Which meant the garrison had known exactly where to be. Which meant my word had traveled true and fast and clean, except the woman had been faster. Sabine had come for me in Greymore before those same soldiers closed their trap on the North Road. She had moved before the arrest, not after it. As if she had known the trap was coming down. As if someone had told her. As if the very same word that reached the garrison had reached her too. I looked around the great hall. At Vesna, sharp and still. At Garrick Grim, behind his gray beard. At Alaric Quill in hand, writing everything I said in a fine and careful script. At the king who had ruled 10 years without ever letting a single soul stand close enough to hold his trust. And a terrible new arithmetic began to work itself out beneath my ribs. Because Kalen had told me that first gray morning why he came to Greymore at all. He had not come for bandits. He had come because he believed there was a leak, a traitor, not on the road, but here, at his own table. And every plan I had just laid bare in this room, every name, every detail, the whole shape of what I knew. I had just handed it entire to whichever person in this hall had been feeding Sabine all along. I closed my mouth. Too late. And in the silence I felt one pair of eyes in that hall settle on me a half-breath longer than the rest. I did not turn to see whose. Not yet, because I had learned a very long time ago that the surest way to lose a thing is to let it know that you have finally, at last, begun to see it. I did not sleep that night either. They gave me a room. A real one, with a bed I did not have to share with the kitchen stores, a fire laid in a proper hearth, a window of thick warped glass that looked out over the black shoulders of the mountains. And I lay in that soft bed, in that warm room, and I stared at the ceiling of Ashkeld, and I did the one thing I had spent my whole life training myself to do. I watched, except this time I watched inside my own memory, turning the great hall over and over, every face, every stillness, every half-breath. Because someone in that room hired Sabine. Because I had walked in and spilled the whole of what I knew across that table, like a girl emptying her apron of stolen apples, and one of those careful faces had gathered every word, and the arithmetic would not let me sleep. Sabine had moved before the arrest on the North Road, which meant she had known the trap was coming, which meant the word I sent to Torvald had reached her almost as fast as it reached the garrison, which meant it was not a leak on the road at all. It was a leak at the top. Someone who saw the reports before the soldiers moved. Someone who sat close enough to the king to know a plan the moment it was born. And there were only so many people who sat that close. I rose before the birds, because I always rise before the birds. And I went looking for the one thing in Ashkeld I had bargained for, and not yet been given. The library. Kalen had said all of it, not just what was thought fit for my rank, and I meant to hold him to it because the answer I needed was not in a face. Faces lie. Faces have spent their whole lives learning to lie. The answer was in the paper. Because a leak leaves a trail. Always. Not in what a person says, but in what a person had to have known, and when in order to say it. I found Vesna in the library before dawn. She was already there, silver hair loose down her back, a single candle burning, a stack of old ledgers open before her. And she looked up at me without surprise, as though she had been sitting there waiting to see whether I was the kind of woman who would come. "You could not sleep," she said. "No, neither could I," she said, and she turned a ledger toward me across the table. "I have been asking myself the same question you have, all night." And there it was, the extended hand, offered not in words, but in a book turned around. We worked in silence as the gray light came up in the tall windows. Vesna knew where the records were kept, and I knew what a lie in paper looks like. And between us we built the thing I had felt in my chest and could not yet see. Every report I had ever sent, the dates they arrived at Ashkeld, the dates the garrison moved, and beside them, in another ledger, the dispatches that went out from the king's own hand, the sealed orders, the ones only a handful of people ever touched. And the pattern rose up off the page like a face out of dark water. Because every time I had sent a warning, the garrison had acted. Good, clean. And every time the garrison acted, Sabine had already moved. A day before. Sometimes two. Except the information the garrison acted on, and the information Sabine acted on, were not the same information. The garrison knew where. Sabine knew when. And there was only one office in all of Ashkeld that held both halves at once, that gathered the where from the field and shaped it into the when for the king, that sat at the exact hinge between what was seen on the road and what was decided at the table. The office of the kingdom's eyes and ears. Alaric. I set down the ledger, and Vesna, watching my face, set down hers. "You see it," she said, softly. I saw it. Alaric, who had written down every word I said in that great hall in his fine and careful script. Alaric, who managed the very network of watchers that was supposed to keep Sabine out, who was better placed than any soul alive to let her in. Because who watches the man whose whole purpose is watching? Who suspects the eyes themselves of blindness? No one. That is the whole terrible genius of it. But there was a thing I had learned in a smoky tavern with a silver coin warming against my hip, and I held to it now. You do not let the thing you have finally seen know that you have seen it. So we said nothing. We went to the king. Kalen listened to us in the gray dawn, with his hands flat on the table, and his winter eyes moving between my face and Vesna's. And when we finished, he was silent for a long and terrible while. "You understand what you are saying," he said at last. "I understand it," I said. "You are naming the man I trusted to find the traitor. As the traitor." "Yes," I said, "because he is the only one who could be. And because you did not come to Greymore for bandits. You came because you already felt it. A cold in the house. A draft under a door you could not find. You have been hunting a shadow at your own table for a year, and you gave the hunt to the shadow himself." Kalen closed his eyes, just for a moment, and in that moment I saw the whole cost of it. A king who had ruled 10 years by trusting no one, and had at the last trusted exactly one man too many. Then we set the trap. Because you do not accuse the eyes and ears of a kingdom on a pattern, in a ledger. He would talk his way clear. He would name it coincidence, and half the court would believe him, because half the court would rather believe a clever man than a serving girl. So we gave him something to steal. Kaelin called his council that afternoon. All of them. Vesna and Garrick and Alaric, and he laid out a plan with grave and weary certainty that he had learned through channels he did not name where Sabine had gone to ground. A hunting lodge near the border crossing at Heldmere, that he would ride at dawn quietly with a small guard to take her himself before she slipped the border. That the matter was too delicate, too personal to trust to the garrison. And I watched Alaric's face as the king spoke. I watched it the way I had watched 100 faces across 100 smoky nights. And I saw the thing move behind his careful eyes. Small, fast, almost nothing. Satisfaction. Because we had just handed him the king. Alone. At a border lodge. With a small guard and no garrison. It was exactly the bait a man like Sabine would kill to swallow. I excused himself an hour after the council broke, and Garrick's men followed him through the dark of Ashkeld, at a distance silent to the low door in the west wall, where he passed a sealed message to a rider who was already saddled and waiting. They took the message, they took the rider, and they took Alaric on the stairs of his own tower, before he had climbed 3 steps. We had him. Except when Garrick's men opened that sealed message, the thing inside was not a warning to Sabine. It was a warning to Kaelin. Because I had made an error, and it was the same error I had made in the Great Hall. I had assumed I could see the whole board, and the board was larger than me. The message read in Alaric's fine, careful hand that the king rode into a trap. That Heldmere was not where Sabine hid. It was where Sabine waited. That she had chosen the lodge herself months ago and salted the woods around it with her own men. And that the story of her hiding there had been fed to the king through a chain so long and so clever that Kaelin believed he had discovered it himself. Alaric was not warning Sabine that the king was coming. Alaric was Sabine's man. Yes, he had been for a year. But he had come to the low door in the west wall that night to break with her. To turn. To warn the one man he had spent a year betraying. I would come to understand why. There was a daughter, it turned out. A girl of Alaric's sickly since birth, and Sabine had learned of her. And a network of watchers is an easy thing to bend when someone has found the one soft place in your armor. He had betrayed his king for a year to keep his child breathing. And he had reached at last the one order he could not carry. Because Sabine did not want the North Road. Sabine did not want House Virant restored. The whole long dance had never been about a fallen house at all. She wanted the throne of Tharn. And she wanted Kaelin dead in the woods at Heldmere, far from his walls and his garrison, and every soul who might stand between him and a blade. And a man who has done a terrible thing to protect a child cannot in the end open a door onto murder and still look at that child. So he turned, too late to be clean, not too late to matter. I stood in the great hall in the middle of that black night, and I read a traitor's confession, written in the same clean hand as the letter that had almost hanged the only mother I had ever known, and I felt the whole shape of it turn over one final time. Because we had caught the wrong crime. We had proven Alaric a traitor, and in the proving, we had nearly missed the thing he was trying in his last and only decent act to tell us. The king was already committed to the ride. The council knew. The court knew. If he did not go, Sabine would know her plan was seen, and she would vanish into the border roads again, the way she had vanished 10 years ago. And this time, She would take Alaric's whole network with her, and she would come back in another 10 years wearing another seal, and there would be another kitchen girl, and another whisper, and another daughter running through the snow. It had to end at Heldmere, but it could not end the way she had written it. So I did the thing I had learned to do in a place where no one ever asked my opinion of anything. I opened my mouth, and I spoke. She salted the woods, I said. To the king, to Garrick, to Vesna, to the whole grim circle of them in the guttering light. She chose the ground, which means she is thinking like a hunter, and a hunter watches the trail. She will have eyes on the Heldmere road from a day out. She will count your guard, and the moment your numbers are wrong, the moment you come with a garrison at your back, instead of a small, quiet party, she will know she is seen, and she will be gone before you reach the tree line. Garrick's jaw was tight. Then we cannot bring the garrison, he said, and without it, we ride into her killing ground with a handful of men. Yes, I said, unless. And here I paused because the thing I was about to say was mad, and I knew it was mad, and I said it anyway. Unless you give her exactly what she is watching for. They looked at me. A small party, I said. The king. A quiet guard. Riding careless up the Heldmere road at dawn, just as she planned it, just as her scouts will count it. Except the king is not in it. Kalen went very still. You mean to send men to die in my place, he said. Low, cold. No, I said. I mean to send men she will not fire on. Because a hunter this patient does not spring the trap on the road. She springs it at the lodge where the ground is hers and the woods are full of her men, and there is nowhere left to run. She will let your party pass. She will let them come all the way in, because she wants you inside the box before she closes it. And while she watches the road, and counts your quiet, careless guard, and licks her lips at how well her plan has worked, Garrick's men come the other way. Through the woods she salted, on foot, in the dark before that dawn, and they salt them right back. The silence in the great hall was a living thing. And you, Kalen said, where are you in this? Because I had learned that, too. That the plan a person makes for everyone else always has a shape-sized hole in it, exactly the shape of themselves, and the honest thing is to say where you mean to stand. I am in the lodge, I said, before any of you, because there is one thing in all of this that only I can give you, and I have carried it 15 years and never once known its worth. I told them then, the thing my mother whispered, because a kitchen girl who carried a tray into the wrong room in House Virant 15 years ago heard more than a plot. She heard a boast, the kind powerful people make when they believe the only ears in the room belong to furniture. She heard how the great houses moved their people in and out unseen, the servants' ways, the doors behind the doors, the Virant trick of building a great hall with a hidden passage behind the hearth so a lord could vanish from his own table, and no man would see him go. Sabine came up in those houses. She thinks like they think. She would never choose a lodge to spring a trap unless that lodge had a door behind the door. And I know how those doors are built, because a dying woman in the snow spent her last breath teaching a frightened child the one thing she had learned in the house that killed her. Where the servant's door always is behind the hearth, left of the flue, a cold draught where there should be none. I can be inside her killing ground, I said, before she ever thinks to look for a servant. Because no one ever thinks to look for a servant. She taught me that herself. She just does not know she was the one teaching. We rode in the last dark before the dawn. I will not pretend I was not afraid. I was so afraid I could taste it, metal and cold, the whole long ride north. But I had been afraid my whole life, and I had learned the trick of it, the one thing Sabine's whole clever web could not account for. My fear does not show. It never has. We reached Heldmere with the sky still black. Garrick's men melted into the salted woods, like water into ground. Kaelin's quiet party formed up on the road, cloaked careless, exactly the picture her scouts would count. And I went in on foot through the trees alone, small and gray and invisible, the way I had gone through the world for 23 years. I found the lodge. I found the hearth. And I found left of the flue, a cold draught where there should have been none. The servant's door. Exactly where a woman 15 years dead had promised me it would be. I went in. The passage was black and close and smelled of old smoke, and I moved through it the way I had moved through 1,000 crowded rooms without sound, without weight, a thing that was not there. And it brought me out behind a tapestry into a long, low hall where a fire burned. And there, at the head of a table, in the amber light, sat Sabine, older now than the tavern had let me see, silver full through her hair. But the court posture had not bent an inch, and the eyes that came up to find me were the eyes of a woman who had never once in her life been caught unready. Until now, because she had built a trap for a king, and she had watched the road all night for his guard, and she had never not, for a single breath, watched the servant's door behind her own hearth, she said, the little serving girl, and in her mouth it was the same word Kaelin had spoken across a smoky tavern a lifetime ago. You. Except where his had been a question, hers was a dismissal. The whole of her contempt folded into a single syllable. I know what you are, she said. I have known for 15 years. A loose thread. A kitchen mouse that should have died in the snow with its mother. You keep saying that word, I said. Serving girl. Like it is small. I took a step into the firelight. But you built your whole plan around servants, Sabine. The passages we walk, the doors we know, the way we move through your grand houses unseen, carrying your wine and your secrets, while you speak your worst above our heads, because you have decided we are furniture. I let that land. My mother was furniture in a room like this one. And she heard you. And she ran. And she spent her last breath in the snow teaching me the one door you forgot to guard. Sabine's hand moved toward the blade at her hip, and she found when she looked that the men she had salted through the woods were not answering, because Garrick's men had already reached them in the dark, quietly, one by one, because the king she had waited all night to kill on an open road had never been on that road at all. And the whole enormous machine of her 15 years, her patience, her clever chains, her seals and her whispers, and her leak at the very top, had just been undone. By a servant. She looked at me across the fire. And for the first time in 15 years, Sabine of the Fallen Court did not know what to say. They took her at Heldmere as the sun came up. Alive. Kaelin was firm on that, in a voice that left no room. Alive, and named and answerable in the light before the whole court. For a kitchen girl 15 years dead, whose name no record had ever bothered to keep. Her name was Aleda, I told him when it was done. My mother. She had a name. Then the court will learn it, Kaelin said. And they did. Alaric answered for his year of treason. But Kaelin, who understood better than any man alive, what it costs to break faith and what it costs more to break back from it, weighed the warning against the crime, and spared his life. A cell, not a grave, and his sick daughter placed under the care of the castle healers, which was, I think, the mercy Alaric had betrayed a kingdom trying and failing to buy, which is more than Sabine would ever have given a serving girl, which was, I think, the whole point. Odessa came to Ashkeld 12 days later. She had hidden herself for a fortnight exactly as she promised, an old woman, folding into the cracks of a village the way she had once folded a frightened child behind a soup pot, and Garrick's escort found her in a root cellar 3 towns south dry and cross, and entirely alive. They gave her a warm room near the great hearth, and a place overseeing the herb stores and the healer's tisanes, which suited her knowledge and her sharp old tongue precisely. The first morning she was there, she found me in the corridor with a stack of library scrolls under my arm. "You look different," she said. "I am in the same dress," I said. "That is not what I mean," she said. And she went on toward the kitchens with the unhurried step of a woman who had decided to approve of something and did not intend to make a ceremony of it. The months that followed were not simple. There were roots of House Virant still to pull, and Alaric's tangled network to unwind. And I sat at that long table through the winter and into the thaw, and gave what I had, which was not a sword, and was not a crown, but a way of seeing that the powerful had spent their whole lives training themselves out of. Vesna began leaving small, precise notes in the margins of the council papers, her version of an open hand. Garrick taught me to read a war map, and never once said I showed promise, and simply never stopped teaching. And Roderick took to leaving the better cuts of meat at my end of the table, which was, I learned how the man said respect and apology at once, without spending a single word. And Kaelin spoke to me the way he had promised. Directly. Without the distance kings put between themselves and the world. We disagreed sometimes. I told him when I thought he was wrong. And twice I was wrong myself and said so without being asked. And both times he received it as something to keep, not something to manage. And there was the other thing. Slow-built, undramatic, accumulating in the way of things that are real. In shared silences over maps. In the way his hand came to rest near mine on the table when a decision had cost us both. In the particular quality of his attention when I spoke in council, and the rest of the room had already moved on. He named it first. On the spring evening, with the tall windows of the great hall finally open to warm air, and the sound of the courtyard drifting up green and new. "I did not expect you," he said. "No one ever expects the person who changes things," I said. "Stay," he said. Not the way he had said it that first gray morning about a table and a task. Different now. Fuller, quieter, carrying more than a request. "Not because I need your mind at this table," he said. "Though I do." A pause. "Because I need you here." I looked at him a long moment. The fire. The open windows. The whole living pulse of a place that had become, in ways I was still learning to trust mine. "I am already here," I said. And I was. We were wed before the first heat of summer. Odessa sat in the front row and did not cry, though her jaw was very tight in the way it got when she was refusing to, which I had long ago learned was the same thing. Roderick stood at the king's right hand and caught my eye across the hall and gave a single small nod. The nod of a man who had misjudged a woman once and had spent a year making it right. And Garrick shook Kaelin's hand and said, "Sound choice, my king, and then turned to me and said, "Sound choice, my queen," with the gravity of a man who had thought hard about whether I had earned the word, and decided that I had. I did not begin that year as a queen. I began it as a girl no one looked at, carrying pitchers in a smoky tavern, watching things no one else thought worth the watching, invisible, and surviving by it. And a king walked through a door and saw me, and the whole world turned. Except that was never quite the truth of it. I know that now, in the quiet of the evenings, when the ceremony is long finished and the hall is emptied, and Kaelin and I sit by the low fire, the way we have always sat close without performance, the day settling into stillness around us. What changed was not that someone finally saw me. What changed was that I stopped believing I needed someone else's permission to be seen, because I walked up to that south wall table with steady hands. I spoke plainly to a king. I carried a secret 15 years and trusted my own judgment about when to set it down. I named my mother in a hall full of nobles who had never learned her name. And I walked into the killing ground of the woman who murdered her through the one door she forgot, and I brought her whole empire of patience to the ground, with nothing but the thing she taught me herself. That the woman carrying the wine is not furniture. That the old woman by the fire is not finished. That the ones the world looks straight through are very often the only ones in the room who see everything. I had been doing it all along. The fire in the great hearth of Ashkeld burned low and warm. Outside the summer night was soft and full of the sounds of a living castle settling into rest. Kaelin's hand covered mine on the arm of the chair, and his thumb moved once briefly across my knuckles. The gesture of a man not made for tenderness, learning it anyway, slowly, and meaning every clumsy inch of it. "Are you content?" he asked. I looked at the fire, at the high stone walls that had become familiar, at the room it had become at last and against every odd mine. "Yes," I said, and it was the simplest and most complete truth I had ever spoken. The story of the serving girl from Greymore and the Alpha King of Tharnan did not end with a battle or a crown or a great reversal of fortune. It ended the way real things end, not with a note that echoes and fades, but with a warmth that settles in and stays, with a hand over another hand, with a fire burning low, with a woman who found the one place in all the world where her particular kind of quiet courage was not a thing to be survived, but the very thing that held everything together. Ren, once invisible, now the woman through whom the kingdom's hardest choices passed on their way to becoming good ones. Now the queen who walked into the most dangerous room of her life, with steady hands and a clear head, and the absolute refusal to be 1 inch less than what she was. And now, at long last, simply home.